Welcome to the Westport Library. Today's program will begin momentarily. Supported by Verso Studios, created locally and shared with the world.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Jennifer Bangser. I'm part of the amazing team here at the Westport Library, and thank you for joining us on this beautiful evening. And welcome to the first in a series of in-depth conversations about art and artists called SmART, and hosted by Westport's own Stacy Bass. Tonight we'll be exploring Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner. It'll be a lively, illustrated conversation between Stacy and her longtime friend Bobbi Coller. And they will talk about these two groundbreaking artists of the radically new abstract expressionist movement that happened in New York City. Stacy Bass began to focus on fine art and commercial photography in college, where she studied political science and photojournalism at Barnard College at Columbia University. She went on to study at the Maine Photographic Workshop with Masters Jay Maisel, Joe Barabon, and William Albert Allard. From her first solo exhibition in 1988, her fine artwork has become part of the numerous private, corporate, and hotel collections, and her images and unique perspectives continues to tap into the emotion and sensibility of a wide spectrum of viewers. Select pieces of her fine artwork are currently represented by Sue Appleton Webster at Swoon Gallery here in Westport. She's also a graduate of the NYU School of Law, where she concentrated on copyright art and entertainment law, and later used her expertise to become vice president of a publicly traded motion picture and television company, Savoy Pictures Entertainment. Stacy's photography has been featured extensively in books and magazines, including At Home, where she was lead photographer for more than 10 years, Garden Design, Lux Interiors and Design, House Beautiful, Elle Decor, Veranda, Ad, Horticulture, Living, etc., British Homes and Gardens, and the Wall Street Journal. She's the author of two best-selling and critically acclaimed monograph books celebrating the American landscape, In the Garden and Gardens at First Light. Bobbi Coller is an art historian, independent curator, and art educator. She received a BS in education from New York University and a PhD in art history from the Graduate Center at CUNY. She has taught modern and contemporary art at Long Island University and has curated over 30 exhibitions, including The Artist Mother, Portraits and Homages, which was shown at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. In addition, several of her exhibitions were circulated throughout the United States by the Smithsonian Institution's Traveling Exhibition Service. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the stage, Stacy and Bobbi.
I always find listening to my bio really embarrassing. How does that feel to you?
I liked listening to your bio. It was very impressive.
And likewise. Well, thank you all for joining us for this conversation. Before we go any further into the topic of tonight, I just wanted to say that I met Bobbi and her husband Barry, I think it was 20 years ago?
About
20 years ago when they purchased my mother's house. And while real estate transactions don't usually result in friendships, especially around here, it really has. And it's been really such a joy to know Barry and Bobbi. They are both extraordinarily accomplished, learned, really brilliant, and incredibly kind people. So it's my delight to welcome Bobbi here today and to talk about one of the topics you know very much about.
I'm very interested in, and thank you, Stacy. It's really a pleasure to be here. And also, I just love this library. We all know that this is totally extraordinary. There is no other community library that has the resources, the programming, the enrichment, and we're all so lucky in Westport to have this. Thank you, Bill Harmer. And thank you, Alex Giannini, for putting this together. And Jennifer, thank you so much. And the people who are making the slides work, the AV, I appreciate it a lot. So let's talk about this very interesting couple.
Yeah, before we dive in, maybe it's a good context setting for you to describe how you got involved with the Pollock-Krasner Foundation. What was it about them as artists or as people that drew you to it and made you want to be involved with their legacy?
Thank you. That's a good question and a good place to start. So, when I think about what drew me to Pollock, I will say that when I was a kid growing up in New York, a painting that I noticed was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it was Autumn Rhythm. And it didn't look like most of the other paintings. I mainly went to the Egyptian department. But I do remember feeling that there was a sense of windy movement and something that made me feel about a fall day when I was quite young. But we fast forward a lot, and I taught art history, and I was assigned the class that I loved, 1945 to the present. And I was teaching on Long Island. And if you start with 1945 and you're teaching modern art, you have to talk about Jackson Pollock. So he was really the beginning and a very important part of the curriculum. And at the time that I was teaching, I learned that his home and studio, along with Lee Krasner, his wife, was going to be open to the public. And it was purchased by, and it was under the umbrella and directed by, Stony Brook University and the Stony Brook Foundation. So this was a great opportunity. I told my students to go and see it, and I went to see it. And since then, starting in the early 2000s, I've been involved with the success of this wonderful place, and I will tell you about it because it's really integral to their stories, to their lives, and to their work. And I found it to be a very authentic place, a place that put me back into the mid-20th century and what art making was like. And in about 2012, which was the anniversary of Pollock's birth, 100 years, I started to chair the advisory board. And so I've been involved with that and enjoy it very much with both their legacies since 2012. And I will show you photographs of the house, so that continues. But I do want to say that this is the Pollock-Krasner House and Study Center, which is separate from, and it's very confusing to everybody, the Pollock-Krasner Foundation. And the Pollock-Krasner Foundation was established after Lee Krasner died. She wanted to leave the money that she had to help support talented and artists who needed financial support because they were talented, both of them, and definitely needed support and didn't get that much support.
Right.
So the foundation gives grants to artists and to institutions. But the House and Study Center is separate, and it is a place to visit and to learn more about the artists.
Who owns the House and Study Center then?
It's the Stony Brook Foundation.
Okay, got it.
Owns the House and Study Center, which is part of Stony Brook University.
Great. All right, let's dive in.
Okay. So this is a sweet picture of Jackson and Lee. I have to tell you, if I were teaching, I had students that would write about Picasso and they'd say, and Pablo did this, and Pablo did that. And I would say, that's a little familiar. Nobody really calls Pablo Picasso Pablo. They call him Picasso. However, I will break my rule because being around this and their legacy and them so long, the people at the house, the people at the foundation, we call them Jackson and Lee, like we knew them. I never knew them, but I will alternate between Pollock, Krasner, and Jackson and Lee.
I like the intimacy of that.
It is. I feel intimate when I see a photograph like this, because this is a sweet photograph of Jackson and Lee. And let's find out first about Jackson Pollock. So this is a young picture of Jackson Pollock. He was born in 1912 in Cody, Wyoming. He only spent 10 months there. He was the youngest of 5 boys. His father was a farmer, but then was not very successful in any of his endeavors. He became a surveyor, and he would go around the country surveying. And at one time, Jackson went with him out west and enjoyed that visit a lot, but he wasn't home that much as a result. His mother was supposed to have been quite stern, didn't speak very much, and not very warm. And people think that he had, people who know him said that he had problems with his mother. But this is a nice young image of him. And this is when he was about 15 or 16. It was taken in California. After Wyoming, they lived in Arizona for a while, the family, and the mother moved them several times. She was kind of ambitious, and he grew up or did his high school years in California, in Chico, California. But you can see that he retained that kind of Western look. And that was kind of part of his persona. Even in New York, he wore cowboy boots. And he liked the West, but he was really energized in New York and exposed to art. Now, I should say that he was not a good student. The only thing he liked in high school was the art course. And he was already drinking in high school and went to a manual high school, and he was thrown out 2 times and never actually graduated from high school. When he was 18, he went to New York to be with his brothers. It's interesting that out of 5 boys, 3 of them wanted to be artists. So he came to New York in 1930, and he joined the classes at the Art Students League. I will give you, so you understand a little bit about his persona and the kind of young man he was. His brother, and his brothers were very good to him. His brother Charles said, young Pollock was self-conscious, insecure, troubled, and driven. So whereas he was insecure about a lot of things, he was very much driven and directed and wanted to be a good artist. That was really his goal. And he came to New York to study with the artist Thomas Hart Benton and to learn more. This is an early self-portrait between 1930 and 33 that Pollock did of himself. And it's pretty intense for a young man. He was looking at other artists, and there's an American artist, Albert Pinkham Ryder, who did very moody, dark color, flowy kinds of work. And this is very much young man influenced by looking at Albert Pinkham Ryder, but also just his head, quite intense, dark, strong colors, small self-portrait that he made. And I don't know if any subsequent, well, there's one, but took him a long time to do any other image of himself.
Was that oil on canvas, or what medium was he using? It's hard to tell.
I've never seen it, but it almost looks like it's on paper. Doesn't it look like a deckled edge? So it's possible, but it looks like thick paint. Whatever surface it's on, it looks quite built up with paint. Somebody knows?
How old was he? How old was he at that point?
Oh, this was like between 18 and 20. It was 1930 to 32, 33. So it's just about the time that he's starting to study in New York. And this is a work by Thomas Hart Benton, his teacher. And I don't know whether anybody, having seen Pollock's classic pour drip paintings, would say, oh, he learned from this artist. But this is where people start. And Benton was a very respected artist who worked very large, big mural-size work. And Benton was associated, he was a kind of a strong macho man who was also from the West, heavy drinker, and he celebrated the heartland of America. And he was one of the prominent artists in a small group called the Regionalists. And I have to remember this name. It's a long name, and it's interesting. It is The Ballad of the Jealous Lover of Green Valley, Lone Green Valley. So even the name gives you a whole story. I mean, it's almost the name of a country western song. There's a lot going on here. But what I want to point out is what Pollock saw with Benton, who did figurative work. You recognize the people very clearly. But what he admired from him is using the entire canvas. You don't even have a horizon line and sky. You've got kind of narrative areas that flow into each other with very curvy wave-type lines and areas. And that wavy rhythm and all-over aspect of it was something that Pollock kept with him really during his whole career. And just to show you, this is a work by Jackson Pollock. The previous one by Benton was 1934, and this is the same year. So Pollock is studying with Benton, and he really had a very good relationship with Benton. Benton became a kind of surrogate father for him, and they had a strong, close relationship. But here you see wavy kind of areas going back into space, a real Western theme. It's called Going West from 1934. Also dark colors like Albert Pinkham Ryder. And he definitely was influenced and learning with Thomas Hart Benton. And even when Pollock changed his style radically, he kept up his relationship with both Benton and his wife Rita. And in archives, we have letters between them, which is very nice to know. But there was another kind of father. And this was not Pablo, but Picasso. This is by Picasso. And, you know, we're in the early 30s. We just saw 1934. Well, 2 years later, Pablo Picasso does this master, large painting, almost mural size, called Guernica. And it was a political protest against the Spanish Civil War that was going on. And it is a very, very powerful, strongly graphic, and it's in grisaille. There's no real color. It's in black and white and gray. It was in the Museum of Modern Art for many years until the death of Franco, when it is now in the Prado in Madrid. So artists, and I should say that the Museum of Modern Art opened for the first time in 1929. So artists, art students, anybody interested in art, they went to MoMA to see the latest, to see work from Europe, to see avant-garde work, and it was really a great gift to art students and to artists, and especially the ones in New York who could see this all the time. So Pollock saw this and saw how powerful and how varied, and Cubism and what Picasso had done, and this was kind of his edible father. His goal was to overthrow Picasso and try to be as well known and as important as Picasso was as an artist.
Did he articulate that goal?
Yeah, he did. And in fact, Lee Krasner says this one incident where they were married and in their house in Springs, Long Island, he was in another room and she heard this big thud. And she went into the room and there was a book about Picasso and it was on the floor. And I wrote down what he said. And he said, God damn it, that guy missed nothing. So that's the way he felt. He wanted to miss nothing, but a lot had been done by Picasso before.
It's a very funny story.
Let's see what I have next. So I think I should talk about, in addition to Picasso, what was going on and what fed him in terms of his really veering away from the regionalism, the look of the West, the figurative work. There were certain strains, and I should say for both artists, the 30s and 40s were a very interesting time and a difficult time in this country. We have the Depression,
Sure.
and they can't make money. We have that leading up to World War II. We have a lot of political turmoil, and we have a lot of angst in the society, war going on in Europe, and 1945, 46 coming out of that. So they are working and during this time, and there's a lot of social things that are feeding into their consciousness. Pollock looked at this painting that was done in 1930 by the Mexican muralist, Jose Clemente Orozco, and he said it was the finest work in America. It's called Prometheus, and it's at Pomona College, and it taps back to Greek mythology. It is in architecture. It is actually the shape so that it was done to fit into the wall. He loved the power of it, the strength of the fiery reds. Prometheus stole fire, and the social aspects also. All of the people needing to have some kind of heroic figure like Prometheus. So the Mexican muralists worked large, they had social impact, and they included Diego Rivera, who we all know, and Orozco, and also Seqirus. Another influence for Pollock was when he was in Arizona, when he was in the West, he witnessed the Navajo Indian sand painters. They were called singers, but that meant that they were healers and shamans. And they would take color sands. They were on their knees working horizontally on the ground. They made pictures for healing, and when they finished making them, they erased them completely. They had a kind of temporary magic about them, and that was made a big impression. And in addition, the Museum of Modern Art had some Navajo demonstrations of this. So he saw it out west, and he also saw it because artists were interested in non-Western and tribal art too. We will pick up and talk about Lee Krasner's life, but just to give you a sense of her persona and what she looked like. She came to New York to study art also, and they met in 1941. And she was kind of a cool, artistic woman. And so I just wanted to throw her in as we proceed in Pollock's life. And when we go back I'll tell you a lot about how they met and their relationship when I talk about Lee. And another major influence, this is an early Pollock that's called Stenographic Figure. And another major influence for Pollock was Jungian theory and philosophy and psychology. So Pollock is in New York. He's studying with Thomas Hart Benton, but he's still a troubled person. And his alcoholism is problematic, and in about 1938, he is in Bellevue Hospital, and he is going to go for psychotherapy. And the name of his psychiatrist, all the artists know the name of his psychiatrist, was Joseph Henderson, and Joseph Henderson was a Jungian therapist. And it really was maybe a good fit for him because he learned about archetypes. He learned about these kind of universal images and symbols, very much part of Jungian theory. And part of his therapy was to actually make drawings. And this is a painting, this is not a therapy drawing, but we do know that he made 80 some odd drawings for his psychiatrist, for his therapist. But this is the kind of work that people would see, quite different than going west, right? So this is stenographic figure, but it's infused with his interest of kind of symbolism, markings, primitive, prehistoric, all of those things come into abstraction. He has ideas and he has images in his head, but he wants to go now with the newest way of making art, which is abstraction, and not figures, and not like looking out the window and seeing a landscape. It is also influenced by Surrealism and Freud, and the idea that your emotions, your dream states, your unconscious is a way of expressing yourself and making your own emotional statement. So a lot of people have looked for things in here, but what I want you to see is the forcefulness, the strong colors, and the kind of unreadable writing that could be from hieroglyphics. It could be from glyphs on Indian mountains. That's the kind of thing that fascinated him. And one other influence was when he was in New York, he went as much to the Museum of Natural History as he did to MoMA and to the new Whitney Museum that just opened in 1930.
So for context, can you share who were some of the other artists that he was considered himself a contemporary of, who were in his social circle and in the art world at that time with him?
Yeah, so really great artists, and they were just beginning, and they were kind of these new abstract artists, and they would go to the Cedar Bar and talk about these ideas together. And when I get to Lee Krasner was really the connected one in terms of the art at the time. And she was able to introduce Pollock to her friends such as Willem de Kooning, Arshile Gorky. They were friendly with Clifford Still, Robert Motherwell. Together, in a few years, they meet Mark Rothko. They meet Herbert Matta. They meet James Brooks. These are really the great abstract expressionists, but they're just beginning, and they are each having their own way of working out what is their own personal abstract vision and style. And so they really were with a very serious and talented group of New York artists.
And all kind of trying to differentiate themselves from the next and get the attention of the gallerists. And
Yes, and I do want to throw in, it's important that you put in the gallerists. I had statistics that in 1932, coming right out of the stock market crash, there were only about 30 galleries in New York, compared to now where there are over 1,000. So this was a small, intimate art group, and you're right, the people knew each other. They showed up at the same places, at the same gallery shows. It wasn't hard to get to all of them. He, of course, had high ambitions, but he was really just starting out. He was in his studio, and not too many people knew about him. This work, however, the reason I put it in stenographic figure, is because he was in a show, and the artist, the great artist, Pete Mondrian, was in New York at the time and went to see the show. And he pointed it out, and I have what he said. So Mondrian said about this stenographic figure, "Something important is happening here. This is one of the most interesting works I have seen in America." And Mondrian was already a really iconic abstract artist. So even though Pollock didn't really have a following, from the very beginning, art people, the other artists, took notice. And in fact, one of his artist friends said, there was something of a hero about Jackson from the very beginning. He did have some presence about him, certainly seriousness, but not someone you wanted to see when he got drunk. He was not attractive, and he got drunk too much. This is another work from the same period. It's called Male and Female. And this is very Jungian also, the kind of complementary things. And you can see, we talked about these kind of uninterpretable hidden language. You can see these symbols, the writing, the geometric shapes, and that's supposed to be a woman on the left with kind of two eyes, Picasso-like eyes, one on top of the other, and the male figure is on the right, and then there is something in the center with these triangles that is some kind of maybe magic message. And also in this same feeling, and these are the works that early on, like 1943, that he was making. This is called Guardians of the Secret. Once again, like two figures on either side, and something in the middle that seems some kind of secret writing, and there's supposed to be a dog. He was also interested in hieroglyphics and Egyptian, and like the dog Anubis, which was an Egyptian god and guard dog. That is, you can see the ears over here. So if you look at all his work and also the kinds of drawings that he was making, where it's more revealing actually of what these things are, there are certain symbols that we can follow. But I want you to get a sense of his earlier work this way.
I think in the interest of getting to Lee, maybe we should move through some of these earlier pieces a little quicker.
So what I wanted to show you is this is a very interesting work called The She-Wolf. And it goes back to, he likes myths, And this goes back to the myth of Lupa, the wolf that nurtured and suckled the two babies, Romulus and Remus, and which turned into eventually the founding of Rome. And what you see on the right is a statue or sculpture of the she-wolf that was in the Frick Museum. Often there are two children underneath, but it's empty, and people think that maybe that is kind of symbolic of the lack of nurturing that he did not have. Just want to tell you about this amazing work. So his work is attracting attention, and Peggy Guggenheim is an heiress and starts a gallery in England and then comes to New York and opens a gallery called Art of the Century, and she's looking for new artists. And Pollock is suggested to her, and she decides that she is going to represent him. So here he is in 1943, and he gets gallery representation, and this gallery was a splash, very, very interesting. And she says, you're gonna have a show in November, and what would be terrific is if you would paint the wall of my new townhouse and do it on the wall, a big wall. I'm gonna have an opening, I'm going to have a party, and your work will be there. So that's great, and he knocks out a wall in his studio. It's 8 by 20 feet wide, and he's blocked. He's not coming up with anything, and the weeks are going by, and the myth goes that the night before, or the day before, he spent 15 hours completing the entire work. Now, fortunately, Marcel Duchamp, who knew him and admired him, said to him before, if you put it on the wall, you're never going to be able to move it. Do it on a canvas. So he made it on a canvas, so it still exists. And when they went to install it, it was 8 inches too big. So he couldn't do it, and Marcel Duchamp snipped off 8 inches on one side, and this is the work. Kind of a frenetic, moving, constantly in motion, and supposedly it started out in his mind as a stampede of animals and turned into this abstract work. And what I'd like to show you is, there is Peggy Guggenheim and Jackson Pollock in front of the mural in her townhouse. So I want to tell you what an advantage was with Peggy Guggenheim. One of the advantages was she made a contract with him where she paid him $150 a month, and he could quit his job. He was working as a guard at the Guggenheim Museum that was then called the Museum of Objective Art, and he also put frames together in the basement. He could devote himself completely to making art. The other thing was, the couple he married Lee Krasner in 1942, and they went out to the Hamptons to visit a friend. And Lee said, maybe we should rent something. And he said, we don't have enough money for what we have now. We can't possibly rent something. The next morning, he woke up and he said, I want to move there. I really liked it out there. We should buy something and move out of the city. They had no money, and Lee went to Peggy Guggenheim and pleaded with her to lend them some money for a house. And this is the mansion that they got in 1945. So it cost $5,000, but it was on 1.4 acres. And this turns into their home and studio area. When they first got it, there was no heat, there was no hot water, and they had to go outside for the bathroom. But they kind of loved it. And it took Jackson out of the city where he was drinking too much, and it took them both into nature. And today, this is the way it looks. They fixed it. They spent about a year working on it to make it livable. And the important thing that they did is they moved the barn for a view, and they made it so that it became Jackson's big studio. And this is the view. If you come to visit, it's in Springs, which is near East Hampton, Long Island. And that's the view from the back that really fueled them and gave them just a new life for both of them. There they are on the property.
Maybe this would be a good time to sort of dip into how they met. The story of how they met, I think, is
It's a
really
great story of how they met. So, as I said, Lee was working and much more connected, and she knew other artists. And Pollock was starting to be recognized, and we're now in 1942. And there was a curator, an artist, John Graham, and he was putting together a show that was going to be French painting and American painting, and selecting the most cutting-edge, up-and-coming artists from New York to be in the show. And he went to Lee, and she was very flattered. And she said, who else is going to be in the show? I know these famous French names, but who's going to be in the show? He showed her a list, and she said, oh, no, no, no. And there was one name on the list, and she said, I never heard of him. Who is he? She said, well, this is Jackson Pollock, and his studio is right around the corner for you. You're on 9th Street, he's on 8th Street. She said, oh, well, she went around the corner, she climbed the stairs, and she knocked on the door, and he answered the door, and she said, I'm Lee Krasner, and I hear we're going to be in the same show. And he said, oh, come on in. And she looked around the room. She couldn't take her eyes off of the work that she saw. And this is what she said about it. She said, I was overwhelmed, bowled over, that's all. I felt as if the floor was sinking when I saw those paintings. So nobody was really doing work exactly like this. And there was an energy. People said that he didn't just paint on the canvas, he attacked the canvas. And she saw that energy, and she really decided that this was a genius. And she wanted to, so she fell in love with his work, and she fell in love with him. And she really devoted, from the time that she met him, she devoted a lot of her energies to making sure that other people knew that he was as talented and a genius.
Do we know what he thought of her work?
He was very respectful of her work. Mm-hmm. She, and they talked. He didn't talk a lot, but he would ask her opinion, and he knew she was a serious, good artist.
And I think a lot of people wonder, did they ever collaborate on any works together?
Not really. They really had their own separate careers, but because they were both abstract artists and working in the same time with similar influences, she loved Guernica and she loved Picasso. They both liked Miro. So there are elements of abstraction that they share, but they had their separate visions. Let's see what else I can show you. So if you go, this is the interior of it, and around that table were other artists and critics. And this is the jewel of this site. It's open to the public, and this is where he worked. And let me tell you a cute story. So when the Pollock-Krasner, when the Stony Brook Foundation got this floor was covered over. They put a new flooring in 1953. But as they looked at old photographs, like we're going to see, they knew that there was something under that flooring. And the first director of the Pollock-Krasner House and Study Center got a videographer to film as she decided to take off the squares of flooring. And when they took it all off, this is what they found. And a former president of Stony Brook University, when he first went to see this, he said, oh my goodness, this is an accidental masterpiece. And that's kind of what we think of it as, because this really occurred, this buildup that looks like a Pollock painting, is because Pollock put those canvases on this wooden floor, and as he poured and dripped and did all kinds of techniques, the overflow went onto the wood floor. So this is the evidence of the paintings that he did in that studio from 1946 until he died in 1956, and he stopped painting in 55. But really, 46 to 53 is the great period. And this is our floor. And we want to protect it. It's like a work of art on the ground. So this is what we do. If you come to visit the studio, and you can walk in the studio, but we make people almost like a temple. They take off their shoes, which will abrade, and I'm sorry if I'm not looking over here, which will abrade the paint, and everybody puts on soft kind of, it's almost like spongy slippers that will not, we've had a conservation expert tell us what you can wear, and that's what they wear. And this is a great image from a series of photographs taken in 1950 of Pollock working in the studio with the wonderful light. We have the remnants of it in his own shoes that are displayed on the stool. and his working materials. He even used a turkey baster. Sometimes he wanted paint to kind of congeal, and he would do it that way. Here's a great picture of them in the corner where you don't have too much of the paint. And Stacy asked me to bring this. I actually curated 2 shows that were in the house, because in the summer they have 2 shows a summer. One was in 2012 and the other 2014. And one was at the 100th anniversary of his birth, called The Persistence of Pollock, with many artists all during the decades after he died, dedicating works and being influenced by him. And the second one was an exhibition about his dealers, the 3 dealers that he used during his life and what his relationship with each of them was like. Now I'd like to get to a very important aspect, because he is really getting recognition. He's got Peggy Guggenheim. They have the house. He's sober. He is working beautifully and making these wonderful classic paintings. And Clement Greenberg, who was an essayist, writer, and then art critic, suggests to somebody at a social gathering, I know the greatest artist now working. It's Jackson Pollock. He's the greatest. The person who overheard this was involved with Life magazine, and they were having a round table about what things to do. And on August 8th, 1949, there was a huge two-page spread, 4 pages, and they asked the question, is he the greatest living painter in the United States? Now, if you read through the article, it's a bit mocking, but he was suddenly thrust into the public awareness. And Life magazine was the place. I mean, it was all magazines that we have today rolled into one. Every doctor's office, most homes had Life magazine, because they covered a variety of things, including culture. And this was a big spotlight for Pollock. Now, Life magazine received almost 600 letters when they published this. 80% of them negative and critical, saying, how dare you do an article like that? He's a sham. Anybody could do this. A child could do this. The public was not at all accepting, admiring of his work. They really thought that that this was just pulling the wool over your eyes. It wasn't art, and it wasn't worthwhile. So everybody knew who he was, and there was this disbelief and real doubt. In addition, though, there was kind of a mythology that grew up around him, because in the early 50s, oh, yeah, I wanted to tell you this too. They didn't believe it, but this is a great quote by Gertrude Stein. All profoundly original art looks ugly at first, and it certainly did look ugly to people at first. But Gertrude Stein was very, very embedded in literature and fine art, and her work was also not really accepted too. So she had an interesting philosophy. So what I just wanted to point out is, in the public sphere, he became known, and he had about him a kind of an attitude and a rebelliousness and a loner quality. And that was a kind of anti-hero that was played out in people like Marlon Brando and James Dean in the early 50s, just about this time. And it's even said that in the 1941-44, Lee and Jackson went to Provincetown and they met Tennessee Williams. And a lot of people think that the character of Stanley Kowalski from A Streetcar Named Desire was based partially on Jackson Pollock, a very kind of volatile, a strong, interesting, distinctive character.
I know we could spend 2 hours just on Jackson Pollock, but we're near. It's not that I want to, but I'm trying to be respectful of everyone's time.
Yeah.
And I think we should give her her due.
Absolutely.
Which I think is really important.
I agree with you, and that's why we're here with both of them. So Jackson described how he gets involved with his process. He's in Vogue magazine, and he does Blue Poles and Autumn Rhythm. And just to tell you, Blue Poles was the most expensive work during his lifetime. It cost $8,000, and he only had this like the last year of his life he really made some money from his art.
And in contrast, what's the highest price one of his works has gone for at auction since his death?
In 2015, it was $200 million. Okay, Autumn Rhythm, I had to bring, this is the one I saw at the Met. Okay, so Lee Krasner, who is she and how is she involved with this whole story? She is the little girl on the right with her sister Ruth. She was born in 1908. She's 4 years older than Jackson, in America, in Brooklyn. But she's the only one. There were 6 children, a boy and 5 girls. She's the youngest. And her parents were very observant Orthodox Jews from Eastern Europe, what is now the Ukraine. Her mother came here first with the children, that happened frequently, and then the father came, and she was born 9 months after his reunion with the family. She was a kind of bohemian, rebellious child in a household where there was no art at all, none on the walls. They were very religious, and nobody was interested in art, but she used to like draw fashion sketches. And she said that she wanted to go to high school so that she could study art. And she went to a high school where they had an art program in Brooklyn, and then went to, the school that she went to was the Women's Art School of Cooper Union. And she went there, and the teacher didn't like her work. She did not do very well. And then switched to a little bit the Art Students Leagues and wanted to get a very good grounding in art, and she went to the National Academy of Art in New York. In order to get to the second level, which was figure drawing from the live figure, you had to put in a work and to be accepted. And she put this self-portrait in to help her to be promoted. The panel thought that this was not really her work. They thought that anybody, she's about 20 years old, anybody that was 20 years old and hadn't gone through their program could not do a self-portrait in plein air, outdoors. You can see that she's outside. And she said, oh, I took a mirror and I nailed it to a tree. I nailed the mirror to the tree, and I did this self-portrait. They didn't believe her, but they accepted her into the figure class anyway. And this is an early Lee Krasner, a kind of a typical student life drawing charcoal work. But I want you to see that she knew how to draw. She could draw the figure, and she went through a rigorous background. She then heard about Hans Hofmann, a European artist who knew Picasso and Braque and was in New York and was teaching about abstraction. So she went in to join his class, forget the academic art. And there's something about her that had a lot of style and a lot of confidence. She had a lot of assurance about her. She's very direct, and they gave her a scholarship, and they took her in the class right away. So this is a class from 1945 showing Hans Hofmann in Provincetown with the students around, learning about Cubism and learning about abstraction. Now, Lee Krasner talked about her time in the Hans Hofmann studio, and she said, first, in the beginning, I didn't know what he was saying because he had a very thick German accent. Then I adjusted. But his style was, and this is a lot of art classes, he would go over to the easel, he would look at your work, he would make a critique, and sometimes he corrected it. At one point, he came over to her easel, and he said, now this is a really good work of art. In fact, he said, and I will quote, this is so good, you'd never know a woman did it. So this gives you an idea of some of the obstacles that a woman artist at that time had to overcome. And she had a lot of confidence, and she had to do that.
And I've also read that she was very critical of her own work and often threw things out if she didn't think they were
That's right.
up to snuff.
She was quite critical. She was like her own editor. And she also changed her approach frequently. If she didn't like one way, she would do another style. But if we want to talk about why she wasn't better known, part of the reason is it's easier to get ahead if you have a very characteristic style and everybody can recognize you. But if you change your style and your method too much, you're not so easy to remember it. And that didn't help her in terms of promoting her art, but that was the way she was. She was quite self-critical too.
Yeah.
But just to give you an idea, here she is in her Cubist stage. She's in her workspace, in her studio, and that's the way her work looked in like about 1940, 1941. This is a portrait of her done by her first partner, boyfriend, who was a very good artist, and then they broke up. And just to give you an idea, this is the way she looked about the time when she went into Pollock's studio, saw his work, but she was an interesting looking woman, tall, slim, strong. Here's the work. So after they move, they get married in 1945, they moved to Springs in 1946, and it's a good time in their marriage. He's sober, he's working hard. She has a bedroom upstairs for her studio. Her works are smaller, and he's got the whole floor of the barn. And she starts on a group of work that she calls her little image paintings. And here is one from 1940. Called Stop and Go, and this is a picture of her with that on the easel. Another little image, untitled, it's in the collection of the Jewish Museum. And she also was pretty good with collage, and they were pretty poor, and what she did is she found this old wagon wheel, and there were some leftover stones and mosaic pieces, and she turned it into a coffee table, a piece of furniture. It was put in an exhibition at one point, but she not only had the mosaic tiles, she also put in a key, she put in a little bit of costume jewelry, she put in some things from around the house that are embedded in the table, and Jackson liked it so much they used it, and I've seen it, it's really quite lovely. So that was a very good period in their life, and they're both working. I will say, though, that she put her career really not to the side, but at a lower level, because Jackson was a handful. And I should read you what she said about him.
Yeah.
She said, "Life with him was a succession of crises. At one moment, he could be beautiful and gentle, and the next he became either explosively angry or totally bottled up." And she really had her hands full managing his career and very, very carefully promoting him, inviting critics and other artists, cooking for them. They had to go all the way out to the East End of Long Island. And so she made her art, but he was like on the top of the list.
And just for reference, when she was alive, what was the highest price that one of her works went for in comparison to?
Well, I have the recent price. I don't know exactly when she was alive. She died in 1984, but they've certainly increased dramatically since then. And I think about 20 million is the highest price.
And in case anyone's interested, there's actually a show right now at the Kasman Gallery in New York City of works from that early period with her
yes, the little image paintings. And also some others. I was there last Thursday, and it's a nice show, and it concentrates on that period of time. And there's an article in Vogue about the show, and she really is getting a lot of attention now as a serious, substantial woman artist who was there when Abstract Expressionism was being founded. She was part of that initial powerful group.
One of the things I really liked about that Vogue article was that they didn't actually mention Jackson Pollock until a few paragraphs in. I was so surprised by that, and I felt like she was finally getting the attention that she deserves, sort of always overshadowed by her relationship with him and
absolutely. If we talk about why people don't know her more, a lot of it has to do with being the wife of maybe the greatest living artist.
Right.
You know, so everybody thought whatever she did had to be influenced by him, or that he told her what to do. She was a woman. She dealt with a lot of, things with him. They didn't have much money. But you're right, finally, this is, it's been growing, but it continues to grow. And what I wanted to just mention one thing, because I had that picture before of the good part of their marriage and life. it started to spiral down because in 1950, the photographer Hans Naimuth, who really didn't know Pollock's work or wasn't really attracted to him, I found out, but was recommended that this was a good artist. He should come and take pictures of him because he liked to take pictures of creative people. And he asked if he could come and photograph Pollock working. And Pollock was not inclined, but Lee thought this would be good promotion for him. She understood media and images. And he came in a series of weekends in 1950, starting in the late summer, like August through the fall. And he went into the studio and he watched and took pictures of Pollock working and making art. And these 500 images that he made have been really the key images that we know of Pollock at work. So
And
this
is that the video that we have as well? Does that show that in motion?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful.
So here also, he went underneath to try and show him. I just want to put this in because the video is the very last.
Yeah.
So just to tell you what happened with the two of them, after the photographs were taken, it did something to Pollock. He just got destabilized. He didn't apparently like the attention. He didn't like being seen, all of that. He didn't like being scrutinized. He had been sober. He went into the house and started drinking again, and started drinking heavily. And from that point on, his work was not as strong. The marriage was difficult because he was drunk a lot. And in 1956, a young woman artist named Ruth Kligman decided that she wanted to meet and get very close to a great male artist. And she went to the bar, the Cedar Bar, and asked someone, there are all these artists, which one is the best? And they pointed to Jackson Pollock, he's the best. And she started to flirt with him, she started to pursue him, she continued to do it, and eventually he responded. And they had about a 6-month affair. And her name, here she is, Ruth Kligman. She was much younger, much more glamorous, kind of, compared to Elizabeth Taylor at the time. And he kind of paraded her around the Hamptons, took her to the beach with him, and he's still married to Lee, and it becomes really, really hard to take. And he also is, if you see pictures of him, he really is depressed, he's just out of control, and he does not even make art for a year from 1955, no longer makes art. Lee is obviously very upset, and they're both invited to go to Paris. They've never been to Paris together or even alone, by their friend Paul Jenkins, who's an artist. Jackson says no, and Lee says, I'm going on my own. She's very hesitant to go. She knows he's very, very fragile, but she's also been really abused and insulted, verbally abused. And she goes to Paris, and while there, Ruth Kligman comes to spend the weekend, and he's also miserable to her because he's miserable.
Yeah.
And he's drinking a lot, and Ruth Kligman brings her friend Edith Metzger, a peer, and Jackson is drunk, but they're supposed to go to a party. He gets in the car with both of them, and not far from their home, he crashes into a tree. He dies, Edith Metzger dies, but Ruth Kligman survives. And Lee is in, and Jackson regretted not being with Lee and sent her flowers when she's in France. And she gets a phone call from Clement Greenberg, the critic, who they knew very well, telling her that Jackson has died. So he is 44 years old, it's 1956, and he is buried near the house in a cemetery not far from where they lived in Springs. And what happened to Lee afterwards in 1956? This is a work by Lee called Prophecy that is right around the time that Jackson died, the last work before his death. And she called it Prophecy. She had bad feelings, omens, that bad things were going to happen. And she moves into Jackson's studio. So if you go and visit, there are marks on the wall And that's from Lee's work, going past the edges, because she worked on the wall. He's the floor and she's the wall. But she moved into that space and her work got larger. And she did two things. She worked and continued to do her art, and I'll show you some samples. But she also was very strategic and smart about Pollock's legacy, where to put the paintings that were left. And she wanted to strategically place them in good museum collections so that he would be elevated and he would be seen among the masters in museums throughout the country.
Which she did despite how she was treated by him.
What'd you say?
Which she did despite how she was treated by him.
Oh,
She
yeah.
believed in the art and put that first and foremost.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so this is a work by her. It's so blown up here that it's a little clearer than this in real life. But you talked about her being her own editor.
Yeah.
And this work is a collage where she cut up work that she didn't like and then collaged it on top of new work that she was doing. So it's an example of her reusing and kind of destroying but reusing in a new way. This is actually a work called Desert Moon from 1955. And you can see she has this collage aesthetic, as though this were pasted pieces of paper, brilliant coloring, and good sense of composition. This is one I like, Combat, from, now I'm trying to remember when Combat is from, but I love seeing the children in front of it. Actually, this one is soon after, about 1969. And Portrait in Green. There was a small show based on Portrait in Green. And she died in 1984. And she had a wonderful 1965 one-woman show in England at the Serpentine Gallery. And it was well received. And she had, her first one-person show was in 1951, and it was mixed reviews, but she was respected, and the critics wrote good things about her. And after that, she had a major show in the 1970s at the Brooklyn Museum. And as you say, she had a show at the Barbican just last year, a one-person show.
So we're about out of time, so I'm hoping we can maybe wrap up
I'm
to
right
give some
at the
time for
movie.
questions.
So she
Perfect.
says, I never violate an inner rhythm. I loathe to force anything. I don't know if the inner rhythm is Eastern or Western. I know it is essential for me. I listen to it and stay with it. I have always been this way. I have regards for the inner voice. So
Perfectly
let her
put.
speak for herself. And the very last is, I thought maybe you'd like to see a very short film. This is the one that Hans Namath did of Pollock working. And I think it's going to play.
Amazing. Thank you, Bobbi.
Thank you. I think we've run out of time for questions tonight, but thank you so much, Bobbi and Stacy, for a wonderful, fascinating presentation, and thank you, everybody, for coming out.
Thank you all
this
for
evening.
coming.
Yes.
Yeah, Bobbi just offered that she's available to answer questions if you'd like to come on the side, which she'll be happy to answer. Thank you.